So I don't know about you, but I am a real sucker for PBS series, especially on Sunday night. So I love Call a Midwife and I love Downton Abbey, and I can watch them a couple times a year. And I'm perfectly happy to just sit there and enjoy it myself. So my newest love is All Creatures Great and Small. So I didn't see that back in the day in the 70s. I was too cool for that, so I didn't watch it. So I've been watching it. It made me go out, and I got his first 3 books, which I've been reading over the course of the last couple of weeks. And while the TV focuses upon the human characters with the animals as a subplot, his books often zero in on the animals with the humans in the supporting roles. And for those of you who haven't seen the series, it's written by an English vet right before and during World War I, before the advent of antibiotics and a lot of modern treatment for animals. And the series is set in this mountainous region near the Yorkshire Plain. And Harriet's vivid description of the fells, I have to look up, after all reading all this, I still have no idea what a fell is. The fells and the dales and the moors and the heathers just make me want to go and visit Yorkshire and to see this. So the books in the series are completely heartwarming and funny and tragic all at the same time. And if you haven't watched it, give it a try, especially now, it'll make you feel good. So deeply embedded in what can only be described as a love story about God's creation is Harriet, the author's gentle humor, poking fun at the lazy, the cheap, the ditzy, the filthy rich, the dirt poor, and the extremely unlucky. And hard work and dedication was no guarantee against the onslaught of disease, for which at the time there was no cure because there were no antibiotics. The death of a spouse often meant the end of life as on the farm. And just like now, the farmers back then would rely on folk tales and sometimes really dangerous remedies. And then, of course, they would call the vet when it was too late, and then their animal would get sick and die. So the tendency, at least for me, when I watch a show like Call a Midwife or Downton Abbey or All Creatures Great and Small, is to paint the past, the bucolic past, with the brush of nostalgia, yearning for the good old days when things were simpler and people were just kinder. And that's why I watch the show, because it makes me feel good. And I'm warm and happy inside, and I don't really have to think too hard. But the creative tension running through Harriet's books, which is not necessarily in the TV show, is his insistence that this point of view is not only incorrect, it's probably dangerous. And we have to be very careful not to be bamboozled by the vivid storytelling and see the times for what they were. Like at all times, there were glimmers of happiness and friendliness. However, the harsh reality was that the residents in this lovely area, including the vet, worked incredibly hard under extreme weather conditions and barely made ends meet. One bad harvest, one animal plague, one serious family illness, and life for all of them was over, including for the vet, who did not live high, pardon the language, on the hog. Yet that reality pales besides the pretty pictures of the lush green grass and the homey cottages with the warm barns and the fresh hay. And life is just so rosy. And I'm thinking it's like, I guess not exactly, but it's like Vladimir Putin's fever dream of a powerful and economically happy, stable Soviet Union. I don't know. So I often think of this layer of goodness and even holiness that gets so often layered over the past and causes us to yearn for those thrilling days and comforting days of yesteryear, when all things just seem so good. And I often experience this in discussions with my late mother, who saw her life with her alcoholic father and her mother, who would get into physical fights with him to the point of actually stabbing him. So those times were somehow better than the times in which she was living, where once silenced voices were loudly and insisting upon making uncomfortable points that she did not necessarily want to listen to. It was the beam in her eye, as the song goes, from the way we were, that time had rewritten every line of her life, making her forget what life was like living with a parent who was drunk every single day of his life and her life. And fortunately for her, her distress was mitigated by the presence of 3 aunts and uncles and multiple cousins who lived on the same block, and their presence was a balm to her in the rough times. The omission, the glossing over, or the retelling of facts results from the enormous beams that unfortunately tend to grow in all of our eyes. And some beams are worse than others because they become so deeply embedded, and they often become securely anchored in place by our deeply held beliefs. And Jesus, as you know, talked a lot about self-inflicted blindness, as he did in today's gospel. The beams, the planks, the scales he mentioned covered over things that he regarded as sin, and the people at the time regarded as the very pillars of their society. And so they were not willing to change. So the high beams of racial prejudice hit me last week when I read the very long apology made to the Black residents of our area by the editors and publishers of the Philadelphia Inquirer last Sunday. Did anybody else read that? So the paper admitted that for too many years, its coverage revolved around white people in stories written by white journalists from the white perspective, shot through with white prejudice in an area with a very large Black population. And there might be some people who might consider this apology political correctness, or to use the more current term, woke. However, if you really think about it, if we remove or rearrange the beams in our eyes and really try to see and listen to Black people, some of whom will hopefully be our friends or our neighbors or our coworkers, we might really come to see that their reality differs from our reality. So this is a couple of the things that I saw after I tried really hard to remove beams of racial prejudice from my own eyes. So over the course of years, I remember my Black friends and coworkers commenting on the vast amount of news coverage spent on covering little white girls trapped in wells or kidnapped or missing. Remember that girl lost in the West? Like it was the opening story on the nightly news. And so they would comment on this. And one of my fellow nurses had a 17-year-old niece who disappeared one day on her way to high school back in the 1990s. And my friend was dismayed by the lack of news coverage and the media's tendency to dismiss her niece's disappearance as nothing unusual in the Black community, as if the disappearance of Black children on their way to school was a common occurrence. And the girl's disappearance and murder, in fact, was a tragedy of epic proportions in my friend's family, just as it would be in any of ours. And on the other hand, the paper was more than happy to cover stories about Black crime and misbehavior while ignoring dysfunctional and criminal behavior in white neighborhoods. And as some of you might know from painful experience, my alcoholic grandfather and reactive grandmother were hardly an anomaly in white families. And also, I think I shared with you before, my grandfather's family were bootleggers in Port Richmond. So they had their own personal jail cell in the 24th Police District. So as a result of the white beams of misinformation, the messaging most white people got from the white news media was that the city was a festering place of crime populated by Black criminals preying on innocent white people. And it was this perspective that led to white flight from the city and depopulated many areas of the city and led to a diminishment of Catholic presence in the city. And the media's ongoing anti-Black slant, I'm sure, led to one of my suburban neighbors publicly and proudly announcing at a school board meeting last month that we suburbanites, unlike those people who live in adjacent Philadelphia, we live in a nice neighborhood, leaving some of us gasping in our seats. Within the context provided not only by the Inquirer, but also by the largely white news media, famous Black people like Katherine Johnson of Hidden Figures fame, or John Lewis, or Dr. King, or Michelle Obama, seem to rise up like solitary and anomalous beacons of success from an otherwise seething mass of dysfunction. And the reality, of course, is that Black families through the generations have produced any number of brilliant thinkers like Katherine Johnson and heroes like John Lewis, along with countless scientists, writers, pastors, musicians, teachers, public servants, and hopefully our next Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Unfortunately, the racialized history we have learned remains carefully separate and unequal, leaving white folks to believe that Black greatness consists of the few that are mentioned during Black History Month. And so, my friends, it is long past the time to remove our respective beams, take them out and examine them for flaws, whatever they might be. And instead, we must lift up our eyes to what our God has always promised us from the very beginning: a whole new world, a dazzling place we never knew, crystal clear with unbelievable sights, to borrow some words from the film Aladdin. And once we are there, in what the writers of the scripture call the New Jerusalem, we can never, ever return to the misty watercolored memories of the way we think things once were. Pictures of the past can no longer hold the things that we have learned. And we must use the present, which is all we have ever had, to create a future that includes the redemption of everyone all together, as the great Black heroes John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer have always insisted. And so we come here together every Sunday in bread and in cup, because as we believe, as our second reading says, we have stripped off our old self with its beams and its scales and its false visions and its revisionist stories. We know we have been transformed in Jesus, who has made all things new. And so, my brothers and sisters, let us get up each morning and clothe ourselves with that new look of love. Let that love be upon our face. Let it be the desire of our hearts and the work of our hands. And let us work each day to create this peaceable kingdom that Jesus imagined, a place where to hurt one of us is to hurt all of us.